Santa Esperanza was one of those villages that don't exist in the world, but live on in the memory of those who have lived with little and felt deeply. With dirt roads and clotheslines that drew paths between wooden houses with peeling paint, everything there moved to the slow rhythm of those who have no hurry because they've already learned to wait. It was as if time walked barefoot, like the village boys, carrying the dust of identical days on its back. At the heart of this forgotten landscape lived Davy, a 12-year-old boy with eyes that could see beyond hunger and routine. He didn't know electronic toys or summer vacations, but he knew how to hear the silence of the trees and find beauty even in a stone on the ground. His mother, Maria, was a laundress, calloused hands, bent spine, but a heart always lifted. She raised her son alone since the father had left, leaving nothing more than a name on the birth certificate. Davy, even without understanding why his father had gone, learned to love what he had, a strong mother and a small but firm faith like a root in dry soil. He didn't complain, he never learned how. Instead, he gave thanks for the sun that dried the clothes, for the water that never failed in the bucket, for the bread that was sometimes only crust. Davy was not an ordinary boy. There was something in his gestures, in his silences, and in his words that resembled the old sages, those whom life teaches before age does. He would wake up before the rooster crowed, help his mother at the wash basin, and then run off to sell candies at the bus terminal, where he learned to hear stories without being noticed. People trusted him without knowing why. Maybe it was the way he looked into their eyes, or the way he offered help even when it wasn't asked for. His face always carried a trace of a smile, not a joyful one, but one that said, "Everything will be okay." He walked barefoot because he had no shoes that fit him, but also because he liked feeling the earth. He said it helped him hear the world better. In his pocket, he carried a white, polished stone that he had found at the age of 6 and called his thinking stone. Whenever sadness came, he would press that stone like someone clutching a prayer. It was his way of talking to God, of asking for strength, of saying he was still there. At school, he was quiet, but attentive. The teacher said he was the kind of student that made silence think. Few knew, but Davy kept a hidden notebook where he wrote down phrases he heard from others, promises he made to himself, and an old dream that echoed like a refrain. One day, I'll be someone who's missed. The central square of Santa Esperanza was more than just a place. It was a mirror. There, time paused to remind the elderly that the past still lived in them and to show the children that the world could be bigger than the village streets. On the cement bench under the shade of an old tree, Jonas spent his days sitting, silent, almost invisible. To those unaware of his story, he was just an old man in a crumpled coat and a stained hat. But those who remembered the village's past knew that Jonas had once owned 3 grocery stores, been a prosperous merchant, and a man of harsh words. He was the type to deny credit even to someone crying, who made jokes about others' hunger and never gave alms, said it encouraged laziness. He had everything, lost everything. The fall came as it does to those who sow selfishness, silently, relentlessly, and justly. What remained was a retirement that barely paid for medicine and a remorse that not even time could heal. Now, he looked at the square with eyes that no longer saw movement, only memories. He saw the boy he humiliated for stealing an apple, the pregnant woman he chased away over 2 reais owed, the brother he broke ties with over a plot of land. Jonas never spoke of this to anyone, but in his mind, these images spun like a broken carousel. That morning, the sky was heavy. The wind came from afar, carrying the scent of rain and the silence of change. Davy walked through the square as he did every day, carrying in his bag what he hadn't sold, a hard loaf of bread, 2 melted candies, and a remnant of faith. Upon seeing Jonas on the bench, he hesitated. Something inside told him that man needed more than he did. And that was how Davy made decisions, not by what was left over, but by what hurt. He approached with firm steps, like someone who knew what they were doing, even without understanding why. Without asking for permission, he sat next to the old man and took the bread from his bag. He broke it in half with his small hands and offered one half to Jonas. He said nothing. He didn't wait for thanks. He just sat there, looking at the square as if he had done what needed to be done. Jonas looked at the boy, then at the bread, then at the ground. His throat tightened, his eyes welled up. It was the first time in years that someone had given him something without expecting anything in return. And it was in that moment, in that scene as brief as it was eternal, that something inside him cracked. A crack that didn't hurt. It relieved. Jonas took the bread with trembling hands and stared at it like one would a relic. He brought it to his mouth slowly, chewing each piece as if they were words he had never learned to say. Davy remained there in silence, his gaze fixed on nothing, his dirty feet swinging in the air. The old man tried to speak, but his voice failed him. Inside his chest, something pulsed differently. It wasn't guilt, it was the beginning of hope. For the first time since he had lost everything, he felt that someone still existed within him, beneath the layers of bitterness, and that someone cried, but it wasn't from pain. It was a clean cry, almost childlike, like someone who had been found after being lost for a long time. Davy, unknowingly, had touched a part of Jonas that even he had forgotten existed. A 12-year-old boy with stale bread and a pure gesture gave the old man something money had never managed to buy in his entire life: wordless forgiveness. And it was there, on that grey morning, that Jonas's heart began to relearn how to beat. After that first encounter, something changed in the rhythm of the square. Days continued the same for others. Delayed buses, children kicking bottle caps, old men arguing politics. But for Davy and Jonas, each morning now had a new meaning. The boy began to sit beside the old man every day, even when he had nothing to offer but his presence. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they just watched the world go by. It was as if that bench had become an invisible confessional, where pain wasn't judged, only heard. Jonas, who had kept his sins inside like stones in a sack for so long, began to tell stories, not ones of glory but of shame. He spoke of his mistakes with a painful clarity, as if he still heard the echo of his wrong choices. And Davy listened as someone who picks up shards to mend a soul, without haste, without judgment. His wide eyes absorbed everything, not as someone who hears a guilty man, but as someone who listens to a warning. One afternoon, Jonas recounted the day he turned away a hungry man who had asked for food for his children. "He called me brother, and I turned my back on him." His voice came out hoarse, trembling. Davy didn't respond. He just placed his small hand over the old man's and remained there with a gesture that said everything without saying a word. On another day, Jonas talked about his younger brother Samuel, with whom he broke ties over a piece of land that years later was swallowed by a flood. "I lost the land, and I lost my brother." Davy asked if there was still time to ask for forgiveness. Jonas replied with his eyes. He didn't know, but at that moment, for the first time in many years, he wished there was. The boy, with his sun-baked clay faith, was planting small seeds in a soil long thought barren, and there in the parched heart of the old man, new questions began to sprout, not the kind that paralyze, but the kind that move us forward. Davy was teaching Jonas that the past can be painful, but it is never an end, only a ground to step on. Davy, for his part, began to see Jonas not as a remorseful old man, but as a mirror of what he didn't want to become. Hearing another's past gave him awareness of his own present. He realized the world was bigger than Santa Esperanza, that the mistakes of men had deep roots, but could also be cut with humility. And that made him grow inside. Each afternoon when he returned home, he would tell his mother that the old man from the square said things that tied his thoughts in knots. Maria would smile, hug her son tight and say, "Listen with your heart, son. That's how we understand grown-ups." Davy didn't know it yet, but he was building there the foundation for his future, a future still wrapped in uncertainty, but already pointing towards something beyond survival. He began to dream of being a mechanic, fixing things, even fixing broken people. Maybe because in hearing Jonas, he understood that everyone is a part that can one day come loose from the world, but can also fit back in. Jonas, who had once been mentioned only in cautionary tales parents told their children, "Don't be like Jonas, who had everything and ended up alone," now began to rewrite his own story. Not that he had changed overnight, but he began to walk with his eyes less fixed on the ground. Instead of just sitting on the bench, he began to bring candies for the children, to offer shade to those who were tired. He even started saving coins to help Donna Teresa with her medicine. When someone asked why, he would answer, "The boy from the square reminded me that I'm still human." And that phrase, said with such simplicity, summed up the silent revolution Davy had started. Because redemption doesn't begin with grand gestures, but with small offerings, a piece of bread, a sincere listening ear, a reminder that everyone has the right to begin again. Jonas was no longer invisible. He was now the old man in the square who helped, who listened, who told stories that no longer ended in sadness, but in lessons. The village started to take notice, first with suspicion, then with admiration. Some said Jonas was too old to change. Others believed the boy was an angel in disguise. But the truth is, change has no mystery. It is made of daily affection, of humility born from the meeting of two extremes, the purity of one who has nothing to lose and the pain of one who has already lost everything. And it was in this unlikely exchange that both found strength. Davy learned to trust his own value, to see himself as more than a poor boy. He felt that his actions mattered, that his presence healed. Jonas, on the other hand, began to carry in his chest a new kind of pain, no longer corrosive, guilt, but a longing for the good he still could do. And that longing moved him. It was as if every morning, when the boy appeared with the same shy smile and the thinking stone in his pocket, God was saying to him, "I'm not finished with you yet." One morning, Davy's absence was felt as a void on the bench in the square. The sun rose timidly, the wind whistled through the leaves of the old tree, but the boy did not appear. Jonas waited for hours, watching the path where he usually came from, counting imaginary footprints in the beaten earth. The old man felt something tighten in his chest, a fear that didn't come from age, but from loss. For the first time in many years, he realized how dependent he had become on that small, bright presence. Davy, without knowing it, was his last anchor, his reminder that he could still be useful, good, alive. Jonas got up with difficulty and decided to look for him, dragging his tired legs through streets he hadn't walked in a long time. He asked, at the shop, at the well, at Maria's house, until the mother, surprised to see him at the door, explained gently that Davy had gotten a job at a workshop in the neighboring town. A big step for someone so small, but who carried inside a giant will to grow. Jonas returned to the square with slumped shoulders, a mix of joy and absence. He was happy for the boy, but felt alone once again. On the bench, he found something he didn't expect. A yellowed envelope with his name written in large, clumsy letters. Inside, a few coins wrapped in cloth and a short note that carried the weight of an entire book. Mr. Jonas, don't forget, to err is human, to change is divine. Thank you for teaching me through your pain. Use this to help someone. I'll be back someday. Jonas read and reread those words with blurred eyes. The coins didn't matter. What moved him was the trust, the recognition, the hope that boy had left with him as a legacy. It was as if Davy had passed on his mission to Jonas, trusting he would now be the hand extended to others, just as Davy had been to him. Moved by this gesture, Jonas began to transform the square into a school. Not a school with walls and blackboards, but of life. He gathered children under the shade of the tree and told stories, the true ones with mistakes and pain, but also with lessons and endings different from his own. He told everyone that each of them could choose who they wanted to be, the one who hurts or the one who heals, the one who keeps or the one who shares. Little by little, he became known as Mr. Jonas of the stories, and no one remembered anymore that he had once been feared or avoided. With every child who listened to his advice with attentive eyes, with every adult who stopped to hear his memories, Jonas felt his life was no longer a trail of mistakes, but a bridge for others to avoid falling into the same pits. His bench was now filled with voices, laughter, and questions, and he answered all with the patience he never had with his own children. Meanwhile, in the neighboring town, Davy was working as a mechanic's apprentice. His small hands learned to dismantle engines and to attentively listen to the sounds of cars, as if each defect had something to teach. But what stood out most was not his skill with tools, but with people. He listened with the same generous silence with which he had listened to Jonas. He said every car had a heart, and each should be treated with respect, like people. His co-workers admired him, and the boss, a man hard in speech and gaze, caught himself smiling when he saw the boy teaching others with simplicity. Davy hadn't forgotten the village, the square, nor the old man. In his workshop locker, among nuts and bolts, was a hand-sketched drawing, a bench, a tree, and two silhouettes sitting side by side. It was his living memory that even the most unlikely encounters can change destinies. Months later, on a clear-skied Saturday, Davy returned to the village. He brought with him a toolbox, a notebook, and a hope that refused to fade. He ran to the square and found Jonas on the same bench, surrounded by children. When the old man saw him, he didn't say a word. He simply opened his arms and let the embrace speak for him. It was long, silent, full of meaning. Davy sat beside him as always. Jonas, with teary eyes, pulled from his pocket the envelope he still kept. "I never spent it. It was the only wealth I was taught to value." Davy smiled, took the envelope, and placed it back in the old man's pocket. "Now it's yours, but use it to change the world, even if it's just one person's world." And so they began again, not as an old man and a boy, but as two men who, in different seasons of life, had taught each other the same lesson. No one is condemned to be who they once were. There's always a bench, a square, a piece of bread that can restart a story. As the days passed, the reunion between Jonas and Davy became news among the villagers. Some found it beautiful, others unlikely, but no one could deny that something had changed in the old man from the square. He was no longer the same man who used to sit there waiting for time to pass. Now Jonas had become a storyteller who didn't spare his own flaws. He spoke of greed with remorse, of loneliness with humility, and of friendship with the tenderness of one who had learned too late the value of affection. When he looked at Davy, he saw in him the reflection of the man he wished he had been. And when he looked at the children around him, he felt responsible for ensuring that his mistakes didn't repeat in their lives. There was in Jonas a quiet faith, born not from rituals, but from living with the truth of a boy. It was as if God, in his wisdom, had sent that child not just to heal him, but to show him that even in the ruins of a life, there is still purpose. Davy, now 13, was no longer just the boy with the candies. He was known as the little big man of the village. When he spoke, people listened. When he helped, no one refused. His mother used to say he had an old soul's voice, a way of touching others without raising his voice. And he kept helping, fixing bicycles, locks, even broken hearts. He knew how to listen without judging, how to look without invading, how to hug without suffocating. It was a gift that didn't come from books, but from love lived in practice. Many said he reminded them of Christ, simple, present, transformative. And maybe it was true, not in the sacred sense, but the human one. Because Davy loved with purity, and that alone was a daily miracle. He never bragged. When asked why he did what he did, he simply said, "Because someone once did it for me." That answer carried the memory of Jonas, the old man who refused to die bitter and who now blossomed like a garden watered by tears and forgiveness. One afternoon, Jonas went to the local school and asked to speak to the students. The principal, surprised, allowed it. And there, in front of curious and attentive eyes, he told his story. He spoke of his mistakes with courage, his losses with sorrow, and his friendship with Davy with gratitude. When he finished, there was silence. A silence filled with respect, different from the one that had accompanied him in the square during the days of rejection. Then came the applause. Jonas cried, not for dramatic effect, but because he realized in that moment that his story was no longer a burden, but a tool, and that freed him. As he left the school, a little girl gave him a drawing. He and Davy sitting on the square's bench with a smiling sun in the sky. Jonas kept it as if it were a trophy. It might have been the only one he'd ever receive, but it was the most deserving, the purest, the most necessary. From that day on, he began visiting schools, churches, and even neighborhood meetings, not to redeem himself, but to sow, because he finally understood that redemption that doesn't overflow into action is just disguised remorse. The years passed swiftly, as they always do when the soul finds meaning. Davy became a real mechanic, opened his own shop called Healing Hands. There, cars came back to life, but so did spirits, dreams, and hopes. Many came to repair their vehicles and left repaired inside. It was a different place where people talked about everything and were truly heard. Davy didn't accept payment from widows or single mothers. Sometimes he'd take a dozen eggs or a loaf of homemade bread, and he never let anyone leave without a smile. His workshop became a meeting point, almost a chapel of the everyday, where faith was preached through actions, and miracles happened in small things. An engine that roared again, a man who dared to believe again. Davy had become exactly what he had always wanted, someone who is missed, but he never forgot Jonas. Every Saturday afternoon, he closed early and went to the square. He sat beside the old man, and together, they told stories like those who plant trees with long shadows. On that bench, one golden autumn afternoon, Jonas, now with skin thin as paper and eyes still full of life, held Davy's hand tightly and said, "If I could go back, I'd do everything differently. But if I could choose one thing to repeat, I'd choose the day you broke bread with me." Davy didn't respond right away. He just smiled and nodded. It was as if he knew that sentence needed no reply. It was a closing by itself. Jonas passed away a few months. Later, in his sleep, peaceful, as if he had left after giving everything he needed to. The village paused for an entire day. The square was full of people, and the bench was covered in flowers. Davy placed on it an envelope with the same note as before. To err is human. To change is divine. Beside it, a piece of bread split in half, and thus ended the cycle of a man who chose repentance and a boy who chose to love without reason. It was the end of a story, but also the beginning of many others. Years later, as an adult, Davy was invited to give a talk at a conference on youth and human values. It was a large auditorium filled with important people, journalists, teachers, and young people from all over the country. He wore a simple shirt, as always, but his eyes carried the depth of someone who had walked through life with his feet on the ground and his heart in the heavens. When he took the microphone, he didn't speak of awards or achievements. He began with a story. He spoke of a forgotten village, a square, an old man, and a piece of bread. He said he learned more from Jonas than from any teacher. that it was in that seemingly small exchange that he came to understand compassion, remorse, and reconciliation. The silence in the room was complete. Many people cried. At the end, a curly-haired girl approached him and said, "I have a grandfather who also made many mistakes. But now I understand that maybe he just needs someone to break bread with him." And at that moment, Davy knew that Jonas's story was still continuing, in echoes, in gestures, in seeds. Over time, the square in Santa Esperanza received a new plaque, the Bench of Hope, where forgiveness sits and kindness begins. It was the villagers' idea, funded through spontaneous donations. It was a tribute, but also a reminder. Schools began bringing their students to hear about Jonas and Davy. Sometimes, the children would draw pictures of the two and pin them to the tree. One boy once wrote, "A new heart was born here." And perhaps he was right, because more than memory, there was movement there, people meeting, listening, forgiving. The legacy wasn't found in monuments or biographies, but in the real change a true story can bring. The village was no longer just a nameless dot on the map. It had become a living symbol that no one is condemned to remain who they once were, and that even a tired old man and a barefoot boy can transform the world, one gesture at a time. In time, Davy got married, had children, and continued to live simply. His house was modest but full of life. In the backyard, there was a tree grown from the seeds of the square. He called it the Daughter of Hope. On Sundays, he gathered his children beneath it and told them stories. He always ended with the same question, "Do you know what's worth more than gold?" The children would shout, "Love!" and he would laugh, shaking his head, "Yes, but also forgiveness." That was the invisible inheritance passed. From generation to generation, he left behind no fortune, no fame, but he left a way of living that spread like light, a way of seeing others with more compassion and less haste. And that, in the end, was everything. Because the world already has too many people who hoard and so few who share. Davy chose to share. His listening, his time, his bread, his faith. And even after his death, many years later, the square lived on. Young people would sit on the bench and read the note reproduced on a small bronze plaque. "To err is human, to change is divine." It was almost an unspoken prayer, a reminder that the past can hurt, but it can also heal, if used as a bridge, not a prison. Some didn't even know who Jonas was. Others had only heard of Davy as a local legend. But what mattered was what happened there. Reconciliations, reunions, conversations that prevented tragedies, gestures that rekindled the light in the eyes of those who had stopped believing in themselves. The square became a daily altar, not one of religion, but of humanity, a place where broken hearts were mended, and where the memory of a boy and an old man kept whispering, "There's still time." Davy and Jonas became, without meaning to, a living parable. One of those stories grandparents tell their grandchildren when they want to teach what really matters. A story without perfect heroes, but with human beings willing to try again. And maybe that's what touches us most. The raw truth, the mistakes made, the chances lost, and yet the miracle of reconciliation. Because deep down, we are all a little bit Davy and a little bit Jonas. We all have a past to forgive, in ourselves or in others, and a future to rebuild. The strength of the boy and the repentant doesn't lie in what was done, but in what was felt. It shows that even when everything seems broken, there's always a gesture that can mend it. And sometimes, it all begins with half a loaf of bread and a place to sit. And so, the story ends, not with applause or fireworks, but with silence and gratitude. A simple ending like a hug, but eternal like everything that touches the soul. The Boy and the Repentant is more than a tale. It is an invitation to listen more, to judge less, to break bread without expecting anything in return. It is a reminder that the most transformative encounters are those that weren't in our plans, but were part of our purpose. That love offered without guarantees is the only kind that truly heals. And that God, in his infinite wisdom, can use anyone, even a bitter old man and a barefoot boy, to write chapters of hope in other people's lives. Because in the end, what changes the world is not great speeches, but small gestures. And this story was made of gestures, one at a time, until it became eternity. Have you ever lived a moment when a simple gesture changed your life forever? Have you ever thought how many stories of redemption may be waiting for a simple "I'm sorry" or an "I'm here"? Share in the comments an encounter that marked your life, or something you wish you could say to someone who drifted away. Your story might touch other souls, and don't forget, the one you help today might be the one who saves you tomorrow.